as George VI returns to his sorrowing capital. And with it, on the oak coffin, is the white wreath of his widow.
Buckingham Palace has announced the death of Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch in British history.
My father, I suppose the last 70 years, has given the most remarkable, devoted service.
The British royal family embodies strength, resilience, and stability.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
Queen Elizabeth II reigned for over 70 years. She saw world wars, presidential assassinations, and revolutions. Nevertheless, the royal family remains a solid example of gleaming British excellence until the crown slips.
There was real fury in the palace. The Queen was very upset that she wasn't told about it.
Because royalty isn't always a fairy tale. Scandal, adultery, and tragedy. Take a look behind the facade and uncover the truth from the monarchy's darkest days. Learn of their tales of romance and heartbreak, death and duty, and understand what really goes on behind those palace walls. In 1936, the reigning King George V died, and his eldest son, Edward, ascended to the throne as King Edward VIII. However, before the year had concluded, he had abdicated the throne to marry his true love, a twice-divorced American woman, Wallis Simpson. The abdication meant that Elizabeth and Margaret's father, Albert, reluctantly had to take the crown and become the next king.
His Majesty is to be presented with the Holy Bible. To enable him to receive it, the Lord Great Chamberlain draws off the jeweled glove, after which the Bible can be delivered. From the coronation chair, His Majesty goes to the chair of state for his inthronization.
Never before has a newly crowned king been able to talk to all his peoples in their own homes on the day of his coronation. And the Queen and I will always keep in our hearts the inspiration of this day.
Thus royalty endures in the greatest empire ever known. To Elizabeth, the 36-year-old Queen, to the Queen Mother Mary, and to her second son, now King, go the empire's love and devotion.
The family were catapulted into the spotlight, and Elizabeth's father was now the centre of the world stage. becoming king greatly strained his life, something his family noticed daily. Princess Elizabeth became heir presumptive, a title that impacted her childhood greatly. Albert was extremely close to his daughters and adored them, calling Elizabeth his pride and Margaret his joy. Elizabeth was just 11 years old at the time, but George immediately recognised that his new role meant that his daughter would one day succeed him as queen.
Princess Elizabeth was very close to her father, always was. I mean, he absolutely adored Margot, Princess Margaret, and Margaret made him laugh, but he was very proud of Elizabeth. And he saw that sense of duty. He spotted it very early on, and he knew that she would be just the sort of queen that the country needed.
Her first appearance, then after King Edward abdicated his new throne, the Yorks became king and queen. Elizabeth, at 10, was now heir presumptive. Reviewing the girl guides at Windsor Castle, the little princesses Elizabeth, 12, and Margaret, 8, assumed new importance. In 1940, Hitler began to bomb England. Thousands of children were evacuated, among them Elizabeth and Margaret, now 14 and 10, who were sent up the Thames to a safer haven.
He didn't actually spend a huge amount of his life with his daughters, but whenever he could, he did. And he taught her to shoot. He took her duck flighting. He did kind of boyish things with her because he had 2 daughters. And he was just so proud of her. So I think they were, especially for the time, they were a very close family. We may not think that now, viewing them from our era, but then they were a close family.
The king asked his eldest daughter to write an account of his coronation so that she could prepare for her own. Elizabeth did as she was told and noted that her father looked very beautiful on the day of the coronation, and she saw a haze of wonder through Westminster Abbey as her father was crowned king. George VI even began assigning royal responsibilities to his eldest daughter. As a demonstration of trust, when she turned 18, George VI named her a Councillor of State, which allowed her to represent the country when her father was away. Tragedy was going to strike on the 6th of February 1952, when King George VI passed away in his sleep at the Sandringham estate, only 7 years after the war had drawn to a close. His early death changed the course of history and influenced what was to come.
When Princess Elizabeth received the news of the death of her father, she went into shock, as you would. I mean, she was shocked by his death because she thought he was getting better. Everybody within the family thought the king was getting better. He was at Sandringham, he'd been out shooting, he'd had a wonderful day, he was with friends, and as Princess Margaret said much later in an interview, he died just as he was getting well. But of course he wasn't really getting well, they thought he was. So it was a huge shock to her. And it meant the end of her life as she knew it. She had 2 little children, a naval husband, and they just started out, really, on their married life.
On tour at the time, Elizabeth had to cancel the rest of the trip after Prince Philip, her husband, gave her the news that her father had passed away and she was now proclaimed queen. Historians say she was remarkably stoic upon hearing the news of her father's passing.
Behind the gates of Sandringham, from the parish church, The time Major MacDonald sounded faintly in the distance as the coffin was put onto the gun carriage, and the impressively simple cortege began the slow procession to the station. Its men reverently transferred the coffin into the funeral coach of the train. Thousands, oblivious of rain and chilling wind. Their presence was the tribute they could pay to him, of whom no more on earth we sing, God. The dead monarch returned to Whitehall, once a kingly way where stood the royal palace.
Came into power when the Crown was in a crisis and steered the country through a turbulent period when the world was in the midst of change. Through the chaos of war and the founding of the Commonwealth of Nations, King George became a figure of hope and stability for people worldwide. He instilled this sense of duty into his family, country, and of course, his daughter. Upon her return to the UK, during an accession council at St James's Palace, Elizabeth promised to follow her father's example. She declared, "I shall always work to advance the happiness and prosperity of my people." Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was 26 when she gave birth to Elizabeth in 1926. 4 years later, in 1930, her second daughter, Margaret, was born. It is believed that she was pretty indulgent as a mother, as well as being protective and not wanting to overburden Elizabeth and her sister with learning. She often said she just wished her daughters would have pleasant memories. Her life changed drastically in 1952 when the king died.
For the Queen, his daughter, the widowed Queen, his wife, and Princess Margaret, the great ordeal begins. The imperial crown, with its 3,000 jewels, glints in the fitful light as George VI returns to his sorrowing capital. And with it, on the oak coffin, is the white wreath of his widow. 15 years ago, he walked here behind his dead father, with no thought of crown or throne, a quiet, shy man, thankful that greatness was not to be thrust upon him. But fate ruled otherwise.
Elizabeth, Margaret, and the Queen Mother bonded very closely, united by shock and grief. This was a time of great difficulty. The Queen Mother lost her husband and her role too. Her daughter, Princess Elizabeth, took her rightful place on the throne. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, now Queen Mother, did everything in her power to ensure that her daughter's transition to the throne was smooth. Although supportive of her daughter, the Queen Mother later withdrew from the public eye. It was decided that she should move to Clarence House so the new monarch and her consort could take their place at the palace.
I feel that we know a little less about the relationship with the Queen Mother, but she doted on her mother because in later years she's always, what would Mummy think? What would Mummy think? We can't do that, it'll upset Mummy. So she was very in awe of her mother, I think.
The Queen Mother was in her 50s when she became what is known as a Dowager Queen. Slowly, she was pushed out of the picture.
She came to Royal Lodge first in 1931, and for a happy few years it was home for her and for her husband. Together they remodeled the house and grounds, which had fallen into disrepair. The war years saw the parkland around dug up for growing vegetables to help the war effort, like gardens all over London. After King George died, Royal Lodge became hers alone. It was central to her life as Queen Mother. The chapel became the most popular place of worship for the royal family. And though the formal announcements would come from Clarence House, her London home, often the heart and centre of her life was at Royal Lodge. For her 90th birthday, the Queen Mother invited the ITN cameras to the gardens of Royal Lodge. It was a marvellous early summer's day. She showed us round with an old friend, Lord Charteris, Provost of Eton, and former private secretary to the present Queen.
It's really a wild garden, you know.
And this is the garden as you planned it?
Well, nature took a great hold, I think, you know.
Now, there are all sorts of stories told about how guests which came to the house were virtually issued with a spade and a lot of charm from you and were told to get on with it.
Kind people did do a little digging and snipping and all that sort of thing. Yes, they were all very helpful. It was great fun to do, you know. It was a bit of a wild place, you might say.
And bonfires?
Masses of bonfires.
Huge.
That's a great joy. I think the king made this garden, you see, really. I mean, he did all the work.
And now we have other friends.
That's right.
Hello.
Oh, ready to do that.
Injuries and illnesses surrounded the Queen Mother's later life.
Only hours later, she braved the freezing weather to visit the royal stud on the Sandringham estate, where she fell and fractured her left hip. She was taken to King Edward VII Hospital in London. Well-wishers arrived with flowers this morning after hearing news of the successful hip replacement operation last night. But complications can follow this type of surgery.
The reality is that the Queen Mother will be at risk of having a thrombosis, a blood clot travelling to the lung, and a fatal pulmonary embolism, or even a heart attack. The complications following hip surgery actually account for as many as 1 in 4 deaths.
She's obviously what we would call a biological survivor. She is a brave lady, and she's done extraordinarily well. And she's got a certain tenacity, a certain amount of fight about her, which is one of the factors, I think, which has endeared her to the country's heart.
On the 1st of August 2001, the Queen Mother had a blood transfusion for anemia after suffering from mild heat exhaustion. However, she was well enough to make her traditional appearance outside Clarence House 3 days later to celebrate her 101st birthday.
The Queen Mother joined by her family to celebrate her 101st birthday on the 4th of August. Just 3 days before, she'd had a blood transfusion in hospital after suffering from anemia. As ever, she was determined not to let age diminish her ability to carry out engagements and thrill the crowds. The advancing years, insisting that she could walk unaided to her seat to witness a pageant great-grandmother who throughout her long life remained at the heart of the nation's affections.
Late that year, aged 101, she fractured her pelvis in a fall. Throughout 2002, the Queen Mother went through a series of accidents that were proof of her frail state.
She is a wonderful ship, and I hope you'll all be very happy in her. And I would like also to give my very best wishes to the ship's company and those at Versailles who helped so much. And now, Captain Stilton, splice the main brace.
Still making jokes and only occasionally showing any signs of unsteadiness.
She fell and cut her arm in her sitting room at Sandringham House. An ambulance and doctor were called and the wound was dressed. She was still determined to attend Margaret's funeral at St George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, 2 days later on the Friday of that week. Her health began to deteriorate precipitously during her last weeks after retreating to Royal Lodge for the final time.
A final farewell to a princess who was today remembered as a mother, a daughter and a sister. The Queen wiping a tear as Princess Margaret's coffin left Windsor for the crematorium. It was her own wish that even her children, Lord Linley and Lady Sarah Chatto, shouldn't follow. A private family funeral was what she had requested. Prince Charles, who spoke this week of his darling aunt, following as the Princess Royal led the mourners. Hidden behind tinted windows, the Queen Mother came by people carrier. Increasingly frail, she hasn't been seen in public since November.
On the 30th of March 2002, she died in her sleep at the Royal Lodge, Windsor Great Park, with her surviving daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, at her bedside.
Tonight, the Queen and Duke of Edinburgh led 3 generations of the royal family into Windsor's Royal Chapel for a service in memory of the Queen Mother. Her coffin will rest inside the chapel for 3 days before being taken to St James's Palace.
Ever since my beloved mother died over a week ago, I have been deeply moved by the outpouring of affection which has accompanied her death. My family and I always knew what she meant for the people of this country, and the special place she occupied in the hearts of so many here, in the Commonwealth, and in other parts of the world. But the extent of the tribute that huge numbers of you have paid my mother in the last few days has been overwhelming. I have drawn great comfort from so many individual acts of kindness and respect. Over the years, I have met many people who have had to cope with family loss, sometimes in the most tragic of circumstances. So I count myself fortunate that my mother was blessed with a long and happy life. She had an infectious zest for living, and this remained with her until the very end. I know, too, that her faith was always a great strength to her. At the ceremony tomorrow, I hope that sadness will blend with a wider sense of thanksgiving, not just for her life, but for the times in which she lived. A century for this country and the Commonwealth, not without its trials and sorrows, but also one of extraordinary progress, full of examples of courage and service, as well as fun and laughter. This is what my mother would have understood, because it was the warmth and affection of people everywhere which inspired her resolve, dedication, and enthusiasm for life. I thank you for the support you are giving me and my family as we come to terms with her death and the void she has left in our midst. I thank you also from my heart for the love you gave her during her life and the honor you now give her in death. May God bless you all.
Princess Margaret was born in 1930, being Elizabeth's only sibling. Despite having an extremely close bond during their childhood, knowing that only one of them could be queen took a toll on Margaret. She often struggled to find a purpose to her role, envying Elizabeth's exceptional dedication and attitude to the inherited duties. Elizabeth was often referred to as the unlikely queen, since her uncle, Edward VIII, was still young and likely to marry and have children of his own, who would precede Elizabeth in the line of succession. But when her grandfather died in 1936, she became second in line to the throne. The dynamic between the sisters began to change as Elizabeth was being prepared for a life serving her country. Margaret began to feel overlooked, giving herself the nickname Second Best Rose. She began to receive a separate education compared to her sister, who was now required to participate in more public engagements and coaching for her pending role as the next monarch. Now second best to her sister, the new heir to the throne, Margaret had to make her mark in the world less conventionally. Naturally, she became more outgoing, a regular partygoer. She had a strong affinity for smoking and drinking. Unfortunately, her enjoyment of an occasional cigarette became a severe addiction, and she became known for smoking up to 60 strong cigarettes a day. Sadly, Princess Margaret passed away on the 9th of February 2002. She died peacefully in her sleep after being hospitalized for another stroke the previous day. She was taken from her home at Kensington Palace to hospital with her children by her side. The Queen made her announcement immediately, informing the world of her sister's death.
You know, on one level, I mean, she was a great character. You know, she really, really was. I sometimes wish it had been possible for the public to have known, generally for the public to have known, how thoughtful and kind and loving she could be.
Among the discs she chose to take with her onto her desert island was a rendition of Rule Britannia, because to her, being patriotic was important. And like her mother, on the anniversary of VE Day, she remembered the lyric.
Floral tributes for Princess Margaret at Kensington Palace this morning. Time for quiet reflection. It's here that Princess Margaret's coffin is resting. Among those paying their respects, a group of brownies. At St. James's Palace, the changing of the guard. A black armband was worn in memory of the Queen's sister. There's been a steady trickle of people coming here to St. James's Palace today to sign the Book of Condolence. But inevitably, comparisons are being made with a public reaction to Princess Diana's death, when thousands of people were queuing up here to pay their respects. Prince Charles was avoiding the cameras today, leaving Sandringham, where along with the Queen Mother, a private service was held for Princess Margaret.
Elizabeth had a complicated relationship with her sister. They often disagreed and had very different ideas about what the monarchy needed to look like and how they should behave. But every step of the way, Princess Margaret remained fiercely loyal to the Queen. Their relationship remained extremely close until the day she died. Quite unusually for the Queen, on the day of Margaret's funeral, she would be seen to wipe a tear from her eye. It is not often the Queen would lose her composure, and it indicated the level of love and affection she felt for her sister. Throughout the years, there was always a constant in Elizabeth's life, always by her side. Prince Philip was the man that offered her unconditional support and devotion. Through hardship and change, Elizabeth and Philip were inseparable for 73 years. Their enduring love and unbreakable bond have been a staple of modern history. Prince Philip was born in 1952 on the island of Corfu, Greece, into the Greek and Danish royal families. His family was exiled from the country when he was only 8 months old. After being educated in France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, Philip joined the Royal Navy when he turned 18. Elizabeth and Philip first met when she was 8 years old, and he was 13. It was during Philip's cousin's wedding, Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, and Elizabeth's uncle, Prince George, Duke of Kent. It wasn't until 5 years later, when Elizabeth was 13 and Philip was 18, that the two met again at the Royal Naval College in Dartmouth. It is believed that at that moment, Elizabeth fell in love with the one who would later become her husband. Elizabeth and Philip were married on the 20th of November 1947 at Westminster Abbey. They received 2,500 wedding gifts from around the world. When they started pursuing their romantic relationship, Philip greatly supported Elizabeth, as she often called him her strength and stay. He was the only one that could give the Queen his honest opinions, and they would often discuss her speeches beforehand. There is no doubt that the unbreakable bond and closeness that she shared with her husband, and the love and support they have afforded one another, has carried them together and made the toils of life that much more worthwhile. Unfortunately, on the 9th of April 2021, Prince Philip, the Queen's dear husband of 73 years, died. He had always been her most excellent support, indeed, so his passing was a terrible loss to the Queen. Due to the COVID-19 restrictions, only 30 people were allowed to attend his funeral.
I particularly wanted to say that my father, I suppose the last 70 years, has given the most remarkable, devoted service to the Queen, to my family, and to the country, and also to the whole of the Commonwealth. And as you can imagine, my family and I miss my father enormously. He was a much-loved and appreciated figure. And apart from anything else, I can imagine, and we're so deeply touched by the number of other people here and elsewhere around the world in the Commonwealth who also, I think, share our loss and our sorrow. And my dear papa was a very special person who, I think above all else, would have been amazed by the reaction and the touching things that have been said about him. And from that point of view, we are, my family, deeply grateful for all that. It will sustain us in this particular loss and at this particularly sad time.
Therefore, stand still. Therefore, close, come.
I'm sure that losing Philip was absolutely dreadful for her. Again, she's very stoic, and she would have. It's not as though it was unexpected. He'd been on a downward path for a few months, so she knew that he wasn't going to last forever. She also knew he didn't want to live to be 100, and she knew how stubborn he was. So I think she probably felt a bit of relief for him, because he was no longer in pain, and he'd gone very peacefully, and I think that was very important to her. And also, the Queen is extremely religious, and her faith would have held her together. I don't think there would have been an outpouring of tears. I think she just sort of withdrew into herself, which is what people of her kind of caliber do. She wouldn't have shown any great emotion, even to her children, I wouldn't imagine, but it would all be inside of her.
Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch in British history, has led a life of commitment, supreme dedication, and duty towards her people. Her life was heavily influenced by the critical people that surrounded her, but also by their deaths and the toll these would take on the course of history.
I am delighted to welcome you to Buckingham Palace on this, the first state visit to Britain by a President of South Africa.
Good evening. Buckingham Palace has announced the death of Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch in British history. Her reign lasted for 70 years, from post-war austerity and the end of empire through the expansion of the Commonwealth.
The nation bid farewell to Britain's longest reigning monarch.
On behalf of all my family, I can only offer the most sincere and heartfelt thanks for your condolences and support. They mean more to me than I can ever possibly express. And to my darling Mama, as you begin your last great journey to join my dear late Papa, I want simply to say this: thank you.
When it was finally announced that the Queen had died, there was an extraordinary outpouring of grief amongst the nation, because the majority of the Queen's subjects had never known another monarch.
You're clearly very, very sad. Tell me how you're feeling right now, Odysseus.
Just in touch with the old situation, you don't think you will be, but it's been part of my life forever.
It was kind of the end of an era. It wasn't just her death, it was the end of an era. It was the end of the Elizabethan age as we know it.
Buckingham Palace was her London home. Today, with military precision, Britain's longest-serving monarch left the palace for the last time. The Queen's coffin, draped in the royal standard and with the imperial state crown on top, was taken slowly through the palace gates aboard a gun carriage. Behind walked the King, his sister and brothers, and behind them the Dukes of Cambridge and Sussex. 25 years ago, the two brothers had their childhood defined by the image of them walking behind their mother's coffin. Today, they honoured their grandmother in the same way.
After a state funeral, she was laid to rest alongside her husband, Prince Philip, her parents, George VI and Elizabeth, and her beloved sister Margaret. The lives, but also the deaths of these remarkable members of the monarchy have shaped the course of history as we know it. Their choices and destinies influence the world we live in today. Their deaths marked a time that the crown was in crisis.